"No one wants to hear from staff," the man said. And just like that, her voice disappeared into the air as if it had never existed. Ava Johnson stood frozen beneath the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, her hands still damp from the silver tray she had been carrying moments before. Her lips parted mid-sentence, but no sound followed because the room had already decided she was not worth listening to. The laughter didn't erupt all at once. It spread, slow and deliberate, like a ripple across polished marble floors, beginning with a smirk from a woman in a tailored ivory dress, then a chuckle from a man swirling a glass of bourbon, until the entire circle of elegantly dressed guests seemed to hum with quiet amusement at her expense. Ava lowered her eyes for a fraction of a second, not in submission, but to steady herself, the weight of 100 dismissive stares pressing against her skin, each one sharper than the last. She had only spoken because she thought it mattered, because she had seen something no one else noticed. But now the truth felt small in her throat, suffocated by wealth, by status, by a room that had already written her role before she ever opened her mouth. "Go on," someone muttered, though it wasn't encouragement, it was mockery, the kind that dares you to embarrass yourself further. A phone lifted subtly from the crowd, its camera angled just enough to capture her hesitation, to turn her into a fleeting spectacle, something to be replayed later with laughter over dinner tables she would never sit at. Ava inhaled slowly, her chest rising against the simple black uniform that marked her as invisible, as replaceable, as someone whose words carried no weight in a room where even silence belonged to the powerful. "I was just trying to help," she said softly, her voice barely cutting through the low murmur, but it was enough for another wave of amusement to roll through the guests, louder this time, more confident, as if they had been waiting for her to confirm exactly what they believed she was insignificant. The man who had first spoken adjusted his cufflinks, his expression bored now, as though the moment had already lost its entertainment value. "That's enough," he said, not looking at her, speaking past her, as if dismissing a misplaced object rather than a person standing 3 feet away. "We don't need commentary from the help." The words landed heavier than the laughter, final, absolute, sealing the space around her into something smaller, tighter, harder to breathe in. Ava felt the room shift, not physically, but in the way attention moved away from her, conversations resuming in fragments, glasses clinking, a violin somewhere in the background continuing its delicate melody as if nothing had happened, as if she had never tried to speak at all. And yet, for a brief second, something didn't align with the rhythm of the room. In the far corner, where the light softened and shadows stretched longer across the floor, a man stood apart from the others, his posture still, his gaze fixed not on the crowd, but on her. Vincent Castellano had been watching the entire exchange without interruption, without reaction, his expression unreadable, the kind of stillness that didn't belong to indifference, but to calculation. While others laughed, he remained silent. While others turned away, he did not. Ava didn't notice him at first, her attention caught in the tightening space around her, in the quiet humiliation that settled like dust over everything she had tried to say. But the moment lingered nonetheless, unnoticed by most, significant to one. "You can go," the man added casually, waving a hand in her direction as if dismissing a server who had overstayed her welcome. Ava nodded once, a small, controlled movement, her fingers curling slightly against her palm as she turned to leave. Not because she agreed, but because the room had made its decision and she understood what it meant to survive inside spaces that never intended to hear her. Each step toward the edge of the room felt heavier than the last, the soft carpet absorbing the sound of her movement, erasing her presence as efficiently as the crowd had erased her voice. She didn't look back. She didn't argue. She carried her silence with her, steady and unbroken, even as it was forced upon her. And just as she reached the threshold, just as the moment threatened to disappear completely into the polished illusion of wealth and control, the air shifted again. Subtle but undeniable, like the pause before something changes. A glass stopped mid-air, a conversation cut short, and somewhere behind her, without raising his voice, without needing to, Vincent Castellano spoke for the first time. No one leaves. The voice did not rise above the music, did not compete with the chatter or the clinking glasses, and yet it cut through everything with a precision that demanded attention without asking for it. Ava stopped mid-step, her hand still hovering near the edge of the service door. Her breath caught somewhere between relief and uncertainty as the room behind her fell into a silence far heavier than the one that had been forced onto her moments before. Conversations dissolved, not because they were told to, but because they could not continue in the presence of that tone, calm, controlled, and unmistakably final. Ava did not turn immediately. She had learned that sudden movements in rooms like this often drew the wrong kind of attention, but the shift in the air was impossible to ignore. The way every gaze seemed to realign toward a single point. The way even the violinist in the corner allowed the final note to linger a second too long before lowering the bow. Vincent Castellano stepped forward from the shadows with an unhurried pace, each movement deliberate, measured, as though time itself adjusted to match him rather than the other way around. He did not look at Ava first. He did not acknowledge her presence at all. Instead, his eyes moved across the guests, one by one, not searching, not questioning, but observing, the kind of quiet scrutiny that made people suddenly aware of themselves in ways they had not been seconds earlier. The man who had dismissed Ava shifted his stance, straightening his jacket as if posture alone could restore his confidence. But something in his expression had already changed, a flicker of uncertainty where there had been none before. "I believe someone was speaking," Vincent said, his voice even, almost conversational, yet carrying an authority that did not need to be announced. The words settled into the room, not loud but immovable, as if they had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. A faint laugh attempted to break the tension, coming from the woman in the ivory dress, but it faltered halfway, dissolving into an awkward cough when Vincent's gaze passed over her without stopping. Ava slowly turned then, her eyes lifting just enough to see him clearly for the first time, the man whose presence had shifted everything without effort. She had seen him before, always from a distance, always surrounded, always untouchable. But now there was no distance, only the quiet space he had created in the middle of the room. "It was nothing," the man said quickly, his tone lighter now, almost dismissive, as if trying to shrink the moment back into something manageable. "Just a misunderstanding with the staff." The word staff hung in the air, smaller than before, less certain, as if it had lost some of its power in the seconds since it was last spoken. Vincent did not respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, not awkward, but intentional. The kind that forces truth to surface simply because there is no room left to hide it. Then, without looking at the man again, he spoke a single sentence: "I did not ask you." The simplicity of it landed harder than any raised voice could have, stripping away the illusion of control the man had been holding on to. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, their attention flickering between Vincent and Ava, as if unsure where it was safer to look. Ava felt her pulse steadying, not because the pressure had disappeared, but because something had changed in the way it pressed against her, no longer isolating, no longer suffocating, but redirecting, shifting its weight elsewhere. Vincent finally turned his gaze toward her, and for a moment, everything else faded into the background. The room, the people, the judgment that had filled the space only minutes ago. His expression was not soft, not warm, but it was clear, focused, and most importantly, it was present. "You said you were trying to help," he stated, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement. Ava swallowed, her throat still tight from the silence she had been forced to carry. But this time, no one interrupted, no one laughed, no one looked away. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice steadier than before, though still quiet, still careful. Vincent nodded once, a small movement that seemed to grant her something the room had denied her earlier. Permission, space, the right to exist beyond the role they had assigned her. "Then you will finish what you started," he said. The words were simple, but their impact rippled outward, reshaping the room in a way no one could ignore. The man who had dismissed her opened his mouth as if to object, but stopped when Vincent's gaze shifted back to him. Not harsh, not aggressive, but firm enough to end the thought before it could form into words. Ava took a breath, deeper this time, the kind that fills more than just the lungs, and for the first time since she had spoken earlier, the room did not feel like something she had to survive, but something she might actually be allowed to stand in. And in that moment, the silence that had once been used to erase her became something else entirely, something that waited, something that listened, something that, for the first time that night, belonged to her. The room did not rush her this time, and that was the first thing Ava noticed. Not the eyes, not the weight of expectation, but the absence of interruption. The space that had been carved out and placed carefully in front of her like something fragile that could shatter if mishandled. She drew in a breath that felt different from the ones before. Less guarded, less shallow, though her hands still carried the memory of tension, fingers pressing lightly against each other as if anchoring herself in place. "There is a problem with the seating arrangement," she began, her voice steady enough to travel across the room without breaking, though still soft, still respectful, as she had always been taught to speak in places that did not belong to her. A few brows furrowed, confusion replacing the earlier amusement, as if the topic itself was too ordinary to justify the attention it was now receiving. The man who had dismissed her earlier let out a short, incredulous breath, shaking his head slightly as if to signal that this was exactly the kind of triviality he had expected. "We have planners for that," he muttered, though not loudly enough to challenge the authority that now held the room in place. Ava did not look at him. She kept her focus forward, her gaze level, her posture composed in a way that did not seek approval, but did not reject it either. "The name cards for table 12, she continued. They were switched. This time, the reaction was subtler, not laughter, but a ripple of uncertainty moving through a few of the guests who had been seated near that section, their expressions tightening as they recalled their placements, their conversations, the quiet assumptions they had made about who belonged where. Vincent remained still, his attention fixed entirely on Ava, not interrupting, not guiding, simply allowing the moment to unfold at its own pace, which somehow made it feel even more controlled. And that matters because the man pressed, his tone sharper now, though still restrained, as if trying to regain control without openly challenging the one person in the room he could not afford to confront. Ava hesitated for half a second, not from doubt, but from the weight of deciding how much to say, how far to go in a room that had already shown her exactly how little it valued her voice. Then she spoke again, because the guest who was supposed to sit there did not. The simplicity of the statement hung in the air, incomplete on its own, but carrying an implication that began to settle in slowly, like a puzzle revealing its edges before its center. A woman near the bar shifted, her glass lowering slightly as she glanced toward the table in question, her earlier confidence replaced by a flicker of something closer to concern. "What are you suggesting?" she asked, her voice careful now, measured in a way that acknowledged the shift in the room without fully committing to it. Ava did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached into the small pocket of her uniform and pulled out a folded card, slightly creased at the edges, the kind that most people would have overlooked, but which she had noticed because noticing small things was part of how she existed in a world that preferred not to see her at all. She held it out, not dramatically, not accusingly, just enough for Vincent to see. "This was on the floor near the service entrance," she said. Vincent stepped forward just enough to take the card from her hand, his movements precise, his expression unchanged as he glanced down at the name printed in clean, formal lettering. The room leaned in without moving, attention tightening around the small piece of paper as if it carried more weight than anything that had been said all evening. Vincent turned the card slightly, his eyes scanning it once, then again, before lifting his gaze toward the man who had dismissed Ava earlier. "You were seated at table 12. He said, not asking, not accusing, simply stating a fact that had already been confirmed in his mind. The man nodded quickly, too quickly, his confidence slipping just enough to be noticeable. "Yes, but I do not see how that is relevant." Vincent held the card up just enough for others to see the name, though he did not announce it, did not need to, because the reaction came instantly from someone across the room, a quiet intake of breath, a recognition that spread faster than any explanation could. Ava watched it happen, the shift, the realization, the way the room that had once dismissed her now began to rearrange itself around the possibility that she had been right all along. "The person assigned to that seat," Ava said carefully, her voice still calm, still controlled, checked in at the front desk, but never made it to the table. The silence that followed was different from before. Not forced, not dismissive, but attentive. Heavy with the understanding that something had been overlooked, something important enough that it had slipped through the cracks of a perfectly planned evening. Vincent lowered the card slowly, his gaze moving once more across the room. But this time, it was not just observation, it was judgment forming, quiet, deliberate, inevitable. And in that moment, the attention that had once been used to diminish Ava now turned fully toward the truth she had carried, waiting, listening, unable to ignore her any longer. The realization did not arrive with noise or chaos. It settled quietly into the room, heavier than any accusation, more unsettling than any raised voice, because it carried something far more difficult to dismiss, the possibility that everyone had overlooked something that should have mattered. Vincent Castellano did not rush to fill the silence. He allowed it to deepen, to stretch just enough that every person present had to sit with it, to feel the shift from certainty to doubt. His fingers held the name card with a steady grip. The small piece of paper, now the center of a room that had moments ago been focused on something entirely different. "Who checked the guest list at the entrance?" he asked finally, his tone unchanged, calm, precise, but directed now, no longer general, no longer passive. A man near the far end of the room, dressed in a tailored navy suit with a discreet earpiece, straightened immediately, his posture tightening as he stepped forward just enough to be seen. "I did, sir," he replied, his voice controlled, though a trace of tension slipped through, subtle but present. Vincent nodded once, acknowledging the answer without judgment, without reaction, as if collecting pieces of a puzzle that only he could fully see. "And the guest assigned to this seat," he continued, lifting the card slightly, checked in. The man hesitated for the briefest second, a pause so small it might have gone unnoticed in any other moment. But here, in this silence, it was unmistakable. "Yes, sir," he said. He arrived approximately 20 minutes before the event began. Ava felt the air shift again, not toward her this time, but toward the space between what had been confirmed and what was now clearly missing. She did not speak, she did not move, but she remained present, her earlier words no longer dismissed, now part of something larger unfolding in real time. Vincent's gaze did not waver. And where is he now? The question landed simply, but its implications spread instantly, moving through the room in a wave of quiet realization. No one answered. No one could. The man with the earpiece glanced briefly toward the entrance, then toward the tables, then back at Vincent, as if hoping the answer might appear if he looked in the right direction. "We believed he was seated," he said carefully, though the uncertainty in his voice had grown more noticeable. Vincent lowered the card slowly, his eyes narrowing just enough to signal that the answer was not sufficient. "Believed," he repeated, not correcting, not criticizing, but isolating the word itself, holding it up for everyone to hear. The room seemed to shrink around that single word. The difference between assumption and certainty suddenly impossible to ignore. Ava watched the reactions ripple outward, the guests who had been laughing earlier now exchanging glances, their expressions more guarded, more aware, as if the foundation of the evening had shifted beneath them without warning. The man who had dismissed her earlier remained silent now, his confidence gone, replaced by a rigid stillness that suggested he understood exactly how quickly control could slip away. Vincent took a single step forward, not toward Ava, not toward the man with the earpiece, but into the center of the space, where his presence alone seemed to anchor everything else. "Then we will not continue," he said. The statement was not dramatic, not loud, but it carried a finality that stopped any remaining movement in the room. A woman near the front frowned slightly, her voice tentative as she spoke. "Is that really necessary? I am sure it is just a simple mix-up." Vincent turned his head just enough to acknowledge her, his expression unchanged. "A simple mix-up does not involve a missing guest who has already entered my home," he replied. There was no anger in his voice, no raised tone, but the weight of his words settled heavily, making it clear that this was not a matter to be brushed aside. Ava felt a quiet shift inside herself, not relief exactly, but something close to recognition, the understanding that what she had noticed, what she had tried to say, had not only been valid, it had mattered. Vincent's gaze moved once more, this time returning to her, not as a focal point, but as a reference, a silent acknowledgement of where this had begun. "You saw the card near the service entrance," he said. Ava nodded, her voice steady when she responded. "Yes, sir. It was on the floor, just inside the hallway." Vincent considered that for a moment, his attention sharpening, his focus narrowing in a way that suggested he was no longer simply observing, but actively reconstructing the sequence of events. "And no one else reported this?" he asked, though the answer was already clear in the silence that followed. The absence of response spoke louder than any explanation could have. Vincent exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in recognition, as if the situation had now fully revealed itself in a way that required no further guesswork. Then, with a calm that made the decision feel inevitable rather than reactive, he spoke again. "We will find him," he said. The room did not question it. It could not, because in that moment, the truth had shifted from something uncertain into something undeniable, and the only person who had seen it from the beginning had been the one they had tried to silence. The words settled into the room with a quiet finality that no one dared challenge, not because they were loud or forceful, but because they carried something far more absolute, a certainty that did not need to be proven twice. Ava remained where she stood, her posture still composed, though the weight inside her had shifted, no longer pressing down, but expanding, filling the space that had once been denied to her. Vincent Castellano did not raise his voice, did not gesture for urgency, yet the effect was immediate. The subtle movement of security personnel repositioning themselves near the exits, the quiet coordination that unfolded without spectacle, as if the entire room had been waiting for a single command to reorient itself. "Check the hallway," Vincent said, his tone even, directed toward the man with the earpiece, who responded with a swift nod before stepping away, his earlier uncertainty replaced by focused action. The guests did not return to their conversations. They could not. The atmosphere had changed too completely. The evening no longer defined by elegance and curated perfection, but by the presence of something unresolved, something that demanded attention. Ava felt the shift in how the room regarded her, not with admiration, not yet, but with awareness, a recognition that she was no longer invisible, that her voice had altered the course of something larger than herself. A woman near the bar, the same one who had laughed earlier, lowered her gaze as Ava's eyes briefly met hers, a flicker of discomfort passing across her face before she turned away. Unable to hold the moment, the man who had dismissed Ava stood rigid, his jaw set, his silence now louder than any of his earlier words, as if he understood that speaking again would only expose how quickly his authority had dissolved. Vincent remained at the center of it all, unmoving, his presence steady, not dominating through force, but through clarity. The kind that left no room for confusion. How long between check-in and seating, he asked without looking at anyone in particular, yet the question found its target instantly. "Approximately 10 minutes, sir," another staff member replied from the side, stepping forward just enough to be heard. Vincent nodded slightly, processing, aligning details in a way that seemed effortless yet precise. "And the card was found near the service entrance," he added, glancing briefly toward Ava, not seeking confirmation, but acknowledging her role in the sequence. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice calm, grounded, no longer hesitant, no longer interrupted. The room listened now, not because they were told to, but because they understood that missing something small could lead to something far greater being overlooked. The man with the earpiece returned sooner than expected, his pace controlled but quicker than before, a subtle signal that something had been found, or perhaps not found at all. He stopped a few feet from Vincent, his expression composed but tight. "The hallway is clear," he reported. No sign of the guest. The absence of confirmation landed heavier than any discovery could have, the reality of the situation becoming sharper, more defined. Vincent did not react outwardly, but his eyes shifted slightly. The smallest change, yet enough to signal that the situation had moved beyond simple oversight. "Security cameras," he said. The instruction was brief, but understood immediately. The man nodded and stepped away again, already speaking quietly into his device, coordinating with others beyond the room. Ava watched the exchange with a steady gaze, her mind replaying the moment she had found the card, the exact placement, the way it had been partially tucked against the wall, as if dropped in a hurry or unnoticed in passing. She had almost ignored it, almost continued with her duties, but something had told her to pick it up, to pay attention. And now that small decision had shifted everything. Vincent turned slightly toward her again, his attention direct, but not overwhelming. "You found it inside the hallway, not outside," he said. Ava nodded. "Yes, sir, just inside. near the service door. Vincent considered that for a moment, his gaze lowering briefly as if mapping the space in his mind, connecting entry points, movement, timing. Then he did not leave the way he entered. He said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. Yet the room heard it, felt it, understood the implication without needing further explanation. A low murmur began to build among the guests, not laughter, not dismissal, but concern, uncertainty, the kind that spreads when control is no longer absolute. Vincent raised his hand slightly, not commanding silence, but restoring it effortlessly. "We will remain here," he said, "until we know where he is." The statement did not invite objection. It did not allow it. And in that moment, as the room settled into a stillness that was no longer imposed but chosen, Ava stood not at the edge of the space, not hidden behind service doors or quiet corners, but within it, her presence no longer questioned, her voice no longer dismissed. The silence that had once erased her now standing as the very thing that revealed the truth. Time stretched in a way that made every second feel deliberate, measured not by clocks, but by attention, by the quiet awareness that something unseen was unfolding just beyond the polished surface of the evening. Ava remained still, her presence no longer questioned, yet not fully understood either, as if the room was still adjusting to the idea that she had shifted its course without raising her voice. Vincent Castellano stood at the center, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady. But there was a subtle intensity now, a narrowing of focus that suggested he was no longer observing possibilities, but following a pattern that had already begun to form in his mind. The low murmur that had started among the guests faded again as the man with the earpiece returned, this time with a tablet in his hand, its screen casting a faint glow against the dim elegance of the room. He stopped just short of Vincent, holding the device carefully, as if aware that what it contained carried more weight than anything spoken so far. "We pulled the footage from the main entrance and the service corridor," he said, his voice controlled, though quieter now, as if instinctively lowering itself in the presence of something significant. Vincent did not reach for the tablet immediately. Instead, he let the statement settle, allowing the room to absorb the fact that answers were no longer abstract. They were visible, recorded, undeniable. Then he took the device, his movements unhurried, his eyes dropping to the screen as the footage began to play. The room leaned in without moving, attention tightening once again. Not on Ava this time, but on the unfolding sequence of images that held the missing piece of the evening. Ava could not see the screen from where she stood, but she did not need to. She watched Vincent instead, the slight shift in his expression, the almost imperceptible pause as he reached a certain point in the footage. The way his thumb stopped mid-motion as if marking something that others might have missed. "Pause," he said quietly, and the man beside him responded instantly, freezing the frame. Vincent tilted the screen slightly, just enough for the man to see, though not enough for the entire room. "This is the guest," he said, his tone steady, confirming what had already been assumed. The man nodded. "Yes, sir." Vincent's gaze remained fixed on the image, but his attention had moved beyond it, tracing something just outside the obvious. "And here," he continued, his finger tapping lightly against the screen. He turns. The man leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he followed the movement. "He should be heading toward the main hall," he said, his voice uncertain now, as if the expected path did not match what he was seeing. Vincent did not respond immediately. He let the discrepancy exist, allowed it to become visible not just to the man beside him, but to the room that waited in silence. "But he does not," Vincent said finally. The words were simple, but they carried the quiet weight of certainty. Ava felt a subtle shift inside her again, not surprise, but confirmation. The sense that what she had noticed was not just a detail, but part of a larger truth that was now unfolding piece by piece. Vincent moved the footage forward slightly, then paused again. "He stops here," he said. The man with the earpiece nodded, though his expression had tightened further. "That is the service corridor," he said. Vincent glanced up briefly, his gaze sweeping across the room, not searching, but acknowledging the shared understanding that was beginning to take shape. "The same corridor where the card was found," he added. No one spoke. No one needed to. The connection was clear, undeniable, linking Ava's observation to the movement captured on the screen. Vincent handed the tablet back without ceremony, his attention already shifting to the next step. The next question that needed to be asked: who was assigned to that corridor, he said. The question moved quickly through the room, finding its answer in a young staff member near the edge of the space, who stepped forward hesitantly. "I was, sir," she said, her voice steady but quiet. Vincent nodded once. "Did you see him?" he asked. The woman hesitated, her brow furrowing slightly as she searched her memory. "No, sir," she said after a moment. "I did not." Vincent held her gaze for a second longer, not questioning her honesty, but measuring the gap between what should have happened and what did. Then he spoke again, his tone unchanged, but carrying a deeper clarity now. Then he did not reach the end of that corridor. He said. The implications settled heavily, narrowing the possibilities, tightening the space in which the answer could exist. Ava felt the room shift once more, not with panic, not with fear, but with a growing awareness that something had occurred within these walls that no one had noticed until now. Vincent turned slightly, his attention returning to her, not as a focal point, but as a constant, a reminder of where this had begun. "You said the card was near the entrance to the corridor," he said. Ava nodded. "Yes, sir." Vincent's gaze held hers for a brief moment, not intense, not overwhelming, but steady, acknowledging the role she had played without needing to say it aloud. Then he looked back at the room, at the guests who had once dismissed her, who now stood in silence, waiting. "Then we are not looking for someone who left," he said quietly. "We are looking for someone who never arrived." And in that moment, the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, no longer hesitant, but absolute, the kind that settles when the truth begins to reveal itself, and there is no longer any place left to hide from it. The silence that followed did not feel empty anymore. It felt precise, like something narrowing into focus, closing in on a truth that had been moving quietly through the room long before anyone noticed it. Ava stood without shifting, her breathing even now, her presence no longer tentative, as if the space around her had finally aligned with the clarity she had carried from the beginning. Vincent Castellano did not move immediately after his last words. He allowed them to settle, to take root in the minds of everyone present, because understanding was not something he forced. It was something he let reveal itself. The guests exchanged glances, not in confusion this time, but in recognition, the kind that comes when a situation no longer fits the assumptions that once made it comfortable. The man with the earpiece stepped forward again, his posture more alert now, his earlier hesitation replaced by a sharpened focus. "We have checked the immediate areas," he said. "There is no sign of anyone matching the description in the corridor or adjacent rooms." Vincent nodded once, absorbing the update without visible reaction, but the slight tightening of his gaze suggested that the pattern was becoming clearer, not more complicated. "Then we adjust the question," he said calmly. Not where he is, but when he stopped being where he was supposed to be. The distinction was subtle, but it shifted everything, turning the search from a location into a moment, from space into time. Ava felt it too, the way the room leaned into that shift, the way attention moved from looking outward to looking back, retracing steps that had been taken for granted. Vincent turned slightly toward the man holding the tablet. Replay from the moment he enters the corridor, he instructed. The footage resumed, and though most of the room could not see it clearly, they followed Vincent's expression, the small changes in his focus, the pauses that marked significance. Ava watched closely, not the screen, but him, learning the rhythm of how he observed, how he filtered what mattered from what did not. There, Vincent said softly, and the footage stopped again. This time, he did not need to explain immediately. He let the silence stretch just long enough for the implication to form. He looks back, Vincent added. The man beside him nodded slowly. Yes, sir. Vincent's eyes remained on the paused frame. People only look back like that for one of two reasons. He continued. Either they forgot something, or they noticed something. The room absorbed that quietly. The logic simple, but the meaning deeper now, more pointed. Ava felt a small shift in her chest, a realization forming alongside his words. Not fully defined yet, but present. Vincent straightened slightly, his attention expanding again to include the room, the staff, the guests, every detail that could no longer be ignored. Who was in that corridor at that time, he asked. The young staff member who had spoken earlier stepped forward again, her expression more focused now, as if she understood the weight of what she might remember. I was there, sir, she said. Vincent nodded, and he prompted gently, not pressuring, but guiding. She hesitated, her eyes lowering for a moment as she searched her memory more carefully this time, not skimming, not assuming. I remember hearing something, she said slowly. Not a voice, just movement, like someone stopping suddenly. The detail was small, almost insignificant on its own, but in the context of everything else, it carried weight. Vincent did not interrupt. He let her continue. I thought it was just another staff member passing through, she added. So I did not check. The admission hung in the air, not as blame, but as a missing piece now placed where it belonged. Vincent nodded once, acknowledging it without judgment. You did what was expected, he said. Then, after a brief pause, he added, But tonight, what was expected was not enough. The words were not harsh, but they carried a quiet lesson that reached beyond the moment, beyond the room itself. Ava felt it too. The difference between seeing and truly noticing, between existing in a space and understanding it. Vincent's gaze shifted once more, this time returning to her with a clarity that had not been there before. Not because he had not seen her earlier, but because now, the full scope of her awareness had been revealed. You noticed something no one else did, he said, not as praise, not as surprise, but as fact. Ava held his gaze for a brief moment, her response simple, steady. I just paid attention, she said. Vincent studied her for a second longer, then nodded slightly, as if confirming something beyond the words themselves. Then he turned back to the room, his presence grounding the tension that had built, his voice calm, but carrying a finality that no one could ignore. Then we will do the same, he said. The room did not move, did not speak, but something had changed, something fundamental. The understanding that this was no longer about a missing guest, but about the moment that had been overlooked, the silence that had hidden it, and the one person who had refused to let that silence remain unchallenged. The shift in the room was no longer subtle. It was undeniable. A quiet transformation that had taken place without spectacle, without force, but with a clarity that left no one untouched. Ava stood at the center of it now, not by position, but by presence. The same woman who had been dismissed minutes earlier, now holding the attention of a room that had once refused to hear her. Vincent Castellano remained still for a moment longer, his gaze moving slowly across the guests, not searching, not questioning, but observing the change in them, the way their posture had adjusted, the way their voices had disappeared entirely, replaced by a silence that no longer erased truth, but revealed it. Attention is not a skill, Vincent said quietly, his voice carrying through the room without effort. It is a choice. The words did not feel like a lecture. They felt like a realization being spoken aloud, something that had already proven itself in the moments leading up to now. No one responded. No one needed to. The lesson had already unfolded in front of them. Vincent turned slightly, his gaze returning to Ava, not with surprise, not with admiration, but with recognition, the kind that does not elevate, but acknowledges what has always been there. "You chose to pay attention," he said. Ava did not smile, did not react beyond a small, steady breath. "Yes, sir," she replied. Vincent nodded once, then shifted his focus back to the room, his expression sharpening just enough to signal that the moment of reflection had ended, and what remained was action. "We return to the corridor," he said. The instruction was simple, but its direction was clear. The man with the earpiece stepped forward immediately. "We have already checked it, sir," he said carefully. Vincent's gaze moved to him, not dismissing, not correcting, but clarifying. "Then we will look again," he said. The difference between checking and looking again settled into the room with quiet weight. The understanding that the first glance had not been enough, that assumption had replaced attention, and that was no longer acceptable. Ava felt something shift inside her again. Not tension, not fear, but alignment. The sense that what she had done instinctively was now being understood, not just by Vincent, but by everyone present. The group moved without announcement, not all at once, but in a controlled flow. Staff leading the way, guests following at a distance, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by the need to witness the conclusion of something they had once dismissed. The service corridor was quieter than the main hall, its lighting softer, its walls less adorned, a space designed for function rather than display. Ava stepped into it with familiarity, her eyes moving instinctively to the spot where she had found the card, the exact placement still clear in her memory. Vincent entered last, his presence filling the narrower space without overwhelming it. His attention already scanning, not the obvious, but the overlooked. "Show me," he said, his voice low, directed toward Ava. She stepped forward without hesitation, her movements precise, stopping at the exact point near the service door where the card had been. "Here," she said. Vincent nodded, his gaze lowering to the floor, then lifting slowly, tracing the space as if reconstructing the moment from the ground up. The others remained silent, watching, waiting, no longer interrupting, no longer assuming. Ava felt the difference in their attention, the absence of judgment, replaced by something quieter, something closer to respect, though no one had said it aloud. Vincent took a step closer to the wall, his eyes narrowing slightly as he focused on a section that appeared no different from the rest, smooth, unmarked, easily ignored. He did not touch it immediately. He simply looked, the way someone does when they are not searching for confirmation, but for truth. Then, slowly, he reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against the surface before pressing just enough to test what could not be seen. There was a faint shift, almost imperceptible, but enough. The panel moved slightly, not opening fully, but revealing a narrow seam that had blended perfectly into the wall. A quiet murmur moved through the group behind him, not loud, not chaotic, but filled with realization, the kind that comes when something hidden becomes visible in the simplest way. Vincent stepped back slightly, his gaze returning to Ava for a brief moment, not to seek approval, but to acknowledge the path that had led them here. "You did not just notice something," he said quietly. "You followed it." Ava met his gaze for a second, her response calm, grounded. "I did not want to ignore it," she said. Vincent nodded once more, then turned his attention back to the hidden panel, his voice steady as he spoke the next words. "And that is why we found it." The corridor fell silent again. But this time, it was not the silence of dismissal, nor the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of understanding, of a truth revealed not by power, but by the willingness to see what others chose to overlook, and the quiet strength of someone who refused to stay unheard. The narrow seam in the wall no longer looked invisible once it had been seen. It carried a presence now, a quiet weight that made the entire corridor feel different, as if it had been holding its breath all along and had finally exhaled. No one spoke at first, not the guests, not the staff, not even the man with the earpiece who stood closest to Vincent, waiting for instruction that did not come immediately. Vincent Castellano remained still for a moment, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the panel, not pushing it further, not forcing it open, but acknowledging its existence with a calm certainty that made the discovery feel inevitable rather than surprising. Ava stood a few feet behind him, her eyes fixed on the seam, her mind tracing back every small detail that had led her to that exact spot, the card on the floor, the slight misalignment in the hallway traffic, the feeling that something did not fit, even when no one else had noticed. Vincent turned his head slightly. Not fully, just enough to address the space behind him without breaking his focus. "Open it," he said quietly. The man with the earpiece stepped forward immediately, his movements careful, deliberate, as if aware that what lay beyond the panel mattered not just to the situation, but to the truth that had been unfolding piece by piece. He pressed gently where Vincent had indicated, and the panel shifted further, revealing a narrow passage behind it, dimly lit, not part of the main design of the house, but integrated so seamlessly that it had gone unnoticed by everyone except the one person who had chosen to pay attention. A soft murmur moved through the group, not loud, not chaotic, but filled with realization, the kind that settles when something hidden becomes undeniable. Vincent stepped aside slightly, allowing the view to open, his gaze scanning the passage without stepping into it, his attention sharp, precise, as if measuring not just what was there, but what it meant. "This was not part of the plan for tonight," he said calmly. It was not a question. It was a conclusion. The man with the earpiece nodded. "No, sir." Ava felt the weight of the moment settle fully now, not just as a discovery, but as a confirmation that what she had sensed had been real, that the silence she had been forced into had nearly hidden something important, something that would have remained unnoticed if she had simply walked away. Vincent turned then, fully this time, his gaze moving across the guests who had followed into the corridor, their earlier confidence replaced by a quiet stillness, their attention no longer dismissive, but deeply focused. The man who had silenced Ava earlier stood near the back, his posture rigid, his eyes lowered, not meeting anyone else's gaze, as if the weight of the moment had settled on him more heavily than the others. Vincent's eyes rested on him for a brief second, not accusing, not condemning, but acknowledging the shift that had taken place, the difference between who he had been minutes ago and who he was now. Then Vincent spoke, his voice calm, but carrying a clarity that reached every corner of the space. A room full of voices, he said, and the only truth came from the one you chose not to hear. The words did not echo, they settled, deep and final, leaving no space for deflection, no room for denial. No one responded, no one could. Ava felt her breath steady, her shoulders easing slightly, not from relief, but from something deeper, the quiet recognition that her voice, once dismissed, had carried more weight than the noise that had tried to drown it out. Vincent's gaze returned to her, steady, direct, not overwhelming, but undeniable. "What is your name?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried a significance that the room understood instantly. The difference between being unseen and being acknowledged. Ava met his gaze without hesitation this time. "Ava Johnson," she said. Vincent nodded once, as if committing it to memory, not as a formality, but as something that mattered. Then he turned back to the passage, his attention shifting once more to the situation at hand, his voice steady as he gave the final instruction. "Secure the area and find the guest," he said. The man with the earpiece nodded and moved forward, coordinating quietly with others, their movements controlled, efficient, without panic, without noise. The guests began to step back slowly, not rushing, not speaking, as if understanding that the moment they had just witnessed was not something to be broken with casual conversation. Ava remained where she stood for a second longer, her eyes resting on the open panel, the hidden space that had nearly gone unnoticed. Then she turned slightly, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, no longer defined by where she stood, but by what she had seen. And as the corridor settled into a new kind of silence, one that no longer erased truth but revealed it, the lesson of the night remained quiet, unspoken, but impossible to ignore. That respect does not follow status, it follows clarity, and that sometimes the strongest voice in the room is the one that refuses to be silenced.